automation and orchestration, endpoint detection and response, network visibility, cloud, containers, DevSecOps, threat intelligence, security platforms. Wondering how to keep up with all the latest security products and trends while still keeping your organization safe? Then stick around to listen to Ready, Set, Secure, the Set Solutions Podcast.
And hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 41 of the Set Solutions Podcast, Ready, Set, Secure, the Set Solutions Podcast and live stream and video and whatever else. As you can see, I have been abandoned by Greg and I am alone in the podcast studio today. But that's all right. Greg is in an unknown location. You can tell where he is. He's locked down to an IP address today because he's doing some work and he's got to, somebody firewalled him off somewhere and he's got just that one IP address. So how you doing, Greg?
Good. How are you?
I'm alone and feeling sad, but that's okay. But no, thanks for joining us again. And everybody is starting to get used to Greg's face, which I think is a good thing. But if you have not watched or listened before, Greg is one of our senior security consultants here at Set Solutions and specifically works on our assessment team, technical assessment team, I guess you would call it. Does a lot of pen testing, red teaming, that kind of thing. He likes to break things and he's very good at it. So appreciate you joining us. And we bring him on anytime we're talking AppSec, which I think is a good segue to Mr. Peter Klimek. Peter is Director of Technology with Imperva in the Office of the CTO over there at Imperva. Peter, you want to give us a real quick rundown?
Yeah, so my name is Peter Klimek, Director of Technology within the Office of the CTO at Imperva. And so my focus at Imperva is really on new and emerging solution sets and technologies and helping the largest organizations in the world really secure their applications, especially as they move to the cloud and deal with all of the challenges that holds. I'm based in Seattle, Washington. Surprisingly, it's actually sunny here today, so it's quite nice and luxurious, but I'm really excited to be here and just chat about my favorite topic, which is application security.
Awesome. Appreciate you coming on, Peter. And if it's sunny in Seattle, that means you don't have to worry about vampires. So that's a good thing. They will sparkle if they show up. So you're good. Okay. Sorry I nerded out there a little bit. So again, welcome to being here. Imperva is a long-standing partner with us here at Set Solutions. Been doing stuff with them for years. I've been doing stuff with them for years. Sold them in other lives. And what's funny, and you may not know this, Peter, that our CEO used to be an SE at Imperva.
No kidding.
Yeah, he was. That's where I met him, actually. I was, and get him to tell you that story one day because it's kind of painful for him because we actually ended up selling a different WAF in that instance. So he's still mad at me to this day about that, but still kind of salty. I think he hired me for revenge just so he could give me grief for the rest of my career. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. As usual, we will jump into our Set Solutions segment real fast, talk about some things we've got going on there. Yours truly wrote a blog post. It is out. It's about some interesting stuff that I've seen in feature gaps in of all things, kind of AppSec, DevSecOps type tools, and some interesting observations I had on how you can lose get some budget line items taken by a certain technology, and then but you actually have a huge feature gap with other technologies, can cause you some problems. So go out and read that if you have a chance. The link's down there below, which is setsolutions.com/blog. Let me know what you think. If you're at all familiar with the work we do in data analytics and Splunk, we've got Ray's situation and framework products that we build. And Greg has had some work he's done in that space as well. Those videos went out. Let us know if you have any questions about Ray's, but we've done a couple of webinars and videos on that here recently. So please let us know. We've got in Dallas and Houston coming up, cyber insurance lunch and learns of all things. Not a lot of fun, not cool tech, but definitely something people are talking about, and it's coming up a lot. And we're going to be partnering with CyberArk and maybe another partner, I'm not sure yet. Then if you like guns, we're going to be doing another shooting event. We've done an OKC one. We've done a Dallas one. Now we're doing one down here in Houston on April 21st. So if you like to go to the range and have fun, let your account manager know. Then GRC webinar coming up with one of our newer partners, SecurityGate. Again, two things that aren't that fun, cyber insurance and GRC. But this one ought to be a really good. SecurityGate's a new partner, but they're very, very strong in this area. So we actually use them internally for some delivery items and stuff as well. And then the big event that we have every year up in Dallas, our golf tournament, is coming up on May 20th. So if you want to go swing some clubs and have fun out there, you may personally get driven by me on a golf cart out around, because I like to do that. I don't golf, but I like to drive a golf cart. So please join us with that and let your account manager know. So that is the quick rundown of all things Set Solutions. Now we'll get into the news segment. So first, I'm going to be talking about, if you know this time of year, Easter is coming up soon. Cadbury is warning of a Easter egg scam. That has so many different jokes, Easter eggs in our industry, everything else, but I'm going to be talking about that. Greg is going to be talking about a large-scale NPM attack with some Azure that are targeting Azure developers. Malicious packaging supply chain problems that keeps coming back over and over and over. Then Peter's going to go over the new Spring Framework zero-day vulnerabilities that came out. Did not have as big of a splash as some of the other ones in the past, but it's still something you need to be concerned about. Another supply chain issue. So we will jump into that. So let me get into my article real fast. We'll talk about that, and then we can get into a little more serious stuff with Greg and Peter. But seriously, Cadbury. If you know, you know who Cadbury is. Got the bunny, always, with the little wiggly nose and the eggs at Easter and all of that stuff. I guess somebody took advantage, and this makes so much sense, but they took advantage of the time of year and sent some stuff out on social media and said you can get a free Easter basket, candy basket, and some other prizes. And somebody asked Cadbury, "Hey, I'm getting this. Is this real?" And Cadbury said, "No, this is not from us." It was on their, I think they said it on their Cadbury UK Twitter account that they've been made aware of it. They said they're currently working to resolve this. I'm not exactly sure what they're doing to resolve somebody sending out Cadbury stuff, some pictures and things, but they're definitely some kind of phishing scam and trying to get people to go grab them. So it's concerning and funny at the same time. But I thought, it's something that we've got to watch out for on a day-to-day basis. I mean, Greg, you got any thoughts about it?
Yeah, I wish I had thought of it when we were doing like a social thing. It's fantastic. It's unfortunate. As funny as it is, these types of social things are just they're going to be a problem. And the only thing we can really do about it is to kind of highlight them when they come up, talk to people about doing diligence. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. Big giant organizations, big giant famous people, generally not trying to give stuff away. So getting people to kind of recognize sense of urgency and those other things that they're trying to trick people and not do it.
What do you think, Peter? You're gonna get some free Cadbury eggs?
Actually, the one thing that I actually admire them about this is, if you do like free crypto giveaway or free money or something like that, everyone's like, awareness alert level just goes up right away because they're like, that sounds too good to be true. But candy, chocolate, Cadbury eggs, that actually sounds, kind of plausible that, hey, there would be a giveaway. And so I think everyone's kind of awareness level or the risk level goes down a little bit for it, which I think is what actually makes this to be really effective as a giveaway. But I think it's one of those things of the old adage of just, don't trust anything on the internet pretty much at all. Yeah. And, frankly, the one thing I will also call out here too is I think this is actually just a big problem across pretty much all social media platforms. I see this on Instagram all the time.
Oh, yeah.
The number of accounts that spring up trying to basically scam based off of giveaways from other accounts and things like that. It's really bad. Instagram is actually terrible at responding to these sorts of things. I know of a couple of accounts that I follow where they're regularly reporting accounts that are trying to piggyback off of them. And just Instagram does nothing about it. So I think everyone just needs to be, extremely cautious no matter what they're giving away, no matter how benign it seems. You really can't click on that or give away your information.
Yeah, no, Instagram being owned by Facebook, they were already really bad at that. Had a pretty high profile CISO friend of mine on Facebook post yesterday that I think it was actually his Instagram account, and he posted that somebody was imitating him. He reported it, and they came back and said, no, they're not breaking any rules. He's like, well, wait a minute. They're literally trying to impersonate me. How does this not pass it's just they just don't put a near enough effort into this to stop it. But yeah, in general, I do think it's not fair that they're trying to ply people with chocolate. I really do think that's wrong.
Play fair.
Yeah, you should not do things like that. So anyway. All right. Well, we will move on to Mr. Greg. Greg, you want to give us a rundown and then tell us what you thought was interesting about this, which is a lot, I think. So.
Yeah. So this article comes from JFrog, and it was posted I guess about 2 weeks ago now, back on March 23rd. And it's a typo squatting attack where you have a malicious actor taking advantage of either misspellings or common mistakes and things like this to get packages installed. So NPM or PyPy has showed up in the past. This one's about NPM. And the idea is to get people to accidentally import or load packages into their software. And then those packages do things that were completely unexpected. In this case, they are after information. It does look like it's reconnaissance. When the package is pulled in, it pulls things like the username, the home directory, an entire directory listing for C and D, and it shuttles all that information out through HTTPS post and a DNS query outbound just to get that information out. The scale of it was kind of interesting to me. There's about 200 plus packages that were identified. They're all targeting the Azure namespace. So for developers that were hooking in or trying to get a hold of functionality related to Azure for their package, if they didn't get that, @ Azure / into their import, it pulled down this bad package. It looks to be an automated attack. The detection was also done automated or automatically. So this was kind of an interesting escalation or things going on. The other part that was interesting to me is some information that was left behind. These packages included things that could probably help identify. There's nothing particularly interesting, but host names that were being excluded. And that's always tricky for threat actors and pen testers, whatever we're doing, of how do we put stuff out in there that doesn't attack us or other things like this, but it does leave artifacts. It's things that can be chased down. So it's another kind of diligence thing to be aware of as we build software.
Peter, you're the deeper expert than I am in this space. Let's see what you think.
Oh, I've got a lot of opinions about this. The first thing I'll talk about here is the NodeJS framework itself and some of the challenges that it has, specifically with regards to supply chain related issues and vulnerable dependencies. One of the problems Node has is basically it's very trusting of literally anything you bring into your code. And so it's very common for these types of dependencies to come in. And the very first thing they'll do is they'll look to dump out things like the environment variables. And the Node framework is very permissive about this. It doesn't have any restrictions built in that prevents that from happening. This is actually one of the motivations that Ryan Dahl, the original creator of Node.js, he went and created Deno, which is an anagram of Node. And one of the things Deno actually solves is kind of limiting the trust of dependencies. So certainly, though, I think one of the bigger challenges that we see is that a lot of people over the years took to storing sensitive information in environment variables, database connection strings, passwords, secret keys, stuff like that. And that type of information is really, really easy to exfiltrate with these malicious packages. And that's why you see them targeting very, very commonly. The other thing I will say, too, is just NPM as a whole. It's also one of the downsides of NPM right now is it doesn't really have that strong check around the namespacing of packages. And so that's what allows you to basically go in and get some of the vulnerabilities in. I think the Node JavaScript community is very aware of all these problems, but the solutions are going to be years in the making, I think, to get there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to your point, it's a multi-layer issue, right? It's there are so many different things that they need to fix on this. Too much or highly permissive framework in and of itself. The repository not checking certain namespace. I mean, it's all across the board. I mean, it's great that the awareness is there, that you got companies like JFrog that are going out and doing these checks for other people. And I would love to dig into their analytics to see what triggered, because it looks like they still had to do a manual look to see what was going on. But I don't know if it's things like the quick growth that they talked about from the 50 packages to the 200 in that amount of time. And that was March 21st. So who knows if it's even still there, but if it grew in that time, even to now, or before they started getting rid of it, it would be really interesting to see what their analytics and what the indicators are there for them. But it's good work all the way around that we've got awareness, or it's good that we've got that awareness and we've got companies that are proactively doing this, but there could be some other things, to your point, Peter, that could improve it. So
one thing I will add in here too is, and not many people know about this, and a lot of times the way these vulnerable dependencies will work is you often will perform a command like npm install to install all of your dependencies. NPM will automatically execute commands with a prefix to it. So if you say npm install, it will automatically implicitly run npm pre-install of these dependencies.
Yep.
And so we've seen in the past crypto miners and things like that getting installed on developer workstations just by running an npm install command. And so those are some of the other challenges I think we've seen over the years with this.
So maybe go check your switches in your command to see what you're actually saying. Oh yeah, just do everything for me. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Yeah, you might want to. You don't have to build the package. Just check to make sure what's getting installed when you do start putting it in. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Greg. Appreciate that rundown. Now, Peter, why don't you bring up your discussion?
Sure. Yeah. So the blog post that I was going to talk about here was probably one of the biggest stories in AppSec last week. And this was, of course, the vulnerabilities in the Spring framework. Now, this one was kind of interesting because there's a lot of confusion around it, first and foremost. So on March 26th, a vulnerability was discovered in Spring Cloud Functions. And this was basically a Spring expression language injection. It basically allowed you to craft a specific header. And with that specific header, you could potentially perform a remote code execution. There was a proof of concept that was released very, very quickly and was out there before a patch was available. And so it garnered a lot of attention, but ultimately Spring Cloud Functions is not really the most common framework or library that's really used. So kind of everyone's like, all right, well, not too big of a deal. But then on March 29th, we actually had another vulnerability that came out. So this was CVE 2022-22-965. And this was specifically related to Spring Core. Now, for everyone out there that's not a Java developer, the Spring framework is basically like what pretty much powers the vast majority of Java web applications and APIs that are out there. Most commonly, it's used as a model view controller, MVC architecture, and it really kind of provides just an overall framework and configuration for our conventions almost for how you actually build these applications. Now, what was really interesting about this one is people were, kind of crying. It was going to be just like Log4j or Log4j2 in terms of the, the impact of it. There was early exploit code. The exploit code that was originally released was actually from one of the early people that identified the Log4j2 vulnerability. And so there was a big rush for people kind of raising the alarm about it. Now, as further investigation went into it, what we found out was that it actually required some more special conditions. It wasn't just, broadly exploitable like Log4j2 was. Two of the big things that are really required was, first of all, you had to be running at least JDK 9, which is pretty new or newish in the Java parlance, which means it's 10 years old. And then the other thing too was specifically the actual application had to be running on Tomcat. An older way or a kind of a traditional way of deploying Java applications would be to use an actual servlet container like Tomcat and deploy it on there. Probably more commonly these days, newer applications use Spring Boot as basically of embedding that container directly with it. And so those two conditions had to be true. So this was nowhere near as widely exploitable as some of the other past vulnerabilities with Log4j2 were. It certainly was remote code execution. It certainly was a major vulnerability. And one of the things that we observed right away at Imperva was within the first 2 days of these vulnerabilities coming out, we observed over 5.5 million attacks. So basically, if you were vulnerable and you didn't have time to patch within the first 24 hours, or you didn't have a protection in front of your application, you probably got popped in that time.
It's an interesting combination of newer version on the JDK and older version on how your stack would be built with Tomcat versus kind of the new implementation. So it's interesting combo that maybe held back not too much, that's but still enough to be concerned. It's interesting because I usually try to stay up to date on these things pretty common. I monitor all of the CVEs and that kind of stuff as much as I can. And this one didn't pop up as quick for me like it normally does, just for whatever reason. And so when I initially looked at it, I was like, oh, that's not a big deal. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, that could be something big here. So and it's always that, oh, it's not too bad, and then somebody finds something else, right? So it's
and that was one of the big concerns was, even though once the initial kind of, factor, or the wow factor of it kind of subsided and we saw that there were conditions that had to be applied, one of the things we had to be really careful about, though, was that there wasn't a vulnerability or an exploit that could be used on Spring Boot. That is always kind of the big thing that everyone's holding their breath about, basically.
I remember watching this one kind of come around, and I watched them. This one struck me as odd because of it kind of inflated very, very fast. And I think without Log4j, we don't see that going on. But there seems to be, like, from a kind of social trend of, we all want to kind of jump on it and be like, oh, it's a huge deal, go patch. We drive people to, go fix your infrastructure. This thing is out there, it's serious. And sometimes we go a little overboard of, Spring for Shell, and we spend some time finding names for things because
creating logos.
Hard to remember. Yeah, how do we get the logo? How do we get it memorable? When I was digging into it, I was like, okay, all of the things about what you need to find. Is it running Tomcat? What versions of the JDK and all of that. I was like, okay, we're narrowing scope, which is good, but these are things that are really easy to find. Like, if your server's touching the internet, we're probably going to be able to find a header for it, and it's all really discoverable. Log4j, we had to craft payloads, we had to stand up infrastructure, we had to capture data to find out if it's working, just spray and pray across the internet to catch it. This one allows for targeting in a much more specific way. And that was a concern, and it's still, CVE trend shows it as top one. It's got 11 million size audience, 11 million people talking about it at the moment. It's a big deal, but it's very different and should be handled different than Log4Shell.
Yeah, the two things I'll say about that. First and foremost, the naming of it, I do have to take offense to that, because there is actually a framework called Spring Shell. So for developers that are familiar with Spring Shell, they're like, well, yeah, it's just another framework that we use. So very poorly named. And I do think it was overhyped to a degree, but it was certainly impactful. And I think the ease of exploitation, I think, was what really kind of made it so much more impactful kind of earlier on. So you didn't need to stand up an LDAP server. You didn't need to do all these other things to actually get it to the point where you could exploit it. So,
all right. Well, thank you for running through that. It's a good discussion. Now let's just go ahead and jump into our main discussion here. So Peter, you and I talked last week briefly while I was driving from a customer site, trying to talk through what we thought we would want to cover. And one of the things that we landed on, and we are going to talk about supply chain stuff. So, but I think we've done a pretty good coverage of that in general with these topics, but I think we're going to come back to that. So while it would feel like a natural segue, I want to completely jerk this in a different direction and talk about, which not a totally different direction. I think it's very good protective, which is runtime application security protection, or RASP, as people know it. So this is Coming from the Fortify world, I believe had the first commercially available Rasp back in the day that was built off of some existing technology that we had. For those of you who aren't familiar with Rasp, if you know the WAF world, the web application firewall, generally built on the network, traffic that's coming to your web applications have to go through that network. They have to go through this box, and they look for problems within it. Pretty limited way that it can control and detect things, just because the way applications work. Can only know what's going across on the wire. There could be, and it can do some protections, but it's not very dynamic in the way it keeps up with applications these days. It was built to be more of a, let's learn your app. It's going to be kind of static. And then in this modern DevSecOps world, man, that stuff flies really fast, and it's really hard to protect with a WAF. So the concept of Rasp, where that's more instrumented into the code and knows what's going on a day-to-day, hour by hour, minute by minute type of, and then being able to actively protect on the box and not in runtime, and not have to worry about looking at it on the wire. I've always been, when I learned about it and kind of got it in my head, I've always was interested in this concept. And also because it's much more generally developer friendly than the previous WAF, where it was all about somebody sticking it on the network. And you generally had some person who didn't know anything about application security trying to configure the rules and everything else. So with that intro, kind of wanted to get your take on Rasp. There's these interesting political issues that pop up when you talk about Rasp, just getting it implemented in the first place. Developers saying, "Oh, I don't want to have an agent." The ops people saying, "I don't want to have an agent on my boxes." Can you kind of get into how you see that with that implementation and how that affects politics, and maybe some ways we can get around that?
Yeah, sure. And that's perfect, I think, introduction to it as the technology itself. I think one thing that I'll kind of just even start with is the difference between kind of that WAF and Rasp, because I think this is something a lot of people get wrapped around the axle on and really kind of thinking about. WAFs themselves, they're designed to speak HTTP. And when you think about how they are basically looking for and mitigating any sort of malicious requests, they're doing it through a lot of either negative or positive security models. So a negative model, you're basically saying, I don't want to see payloads that look like this. Positive security model, you're basically saying, this is what the application should be accepting for these requests, and don't allow anything else in there. Now, I think the challenge that we often see is with the negative security models, any vulnerability that you get, basically, there's lots of different permutations to it. So great example was Log4j. There was the initial Log4j vulnerability that came out, and ultimately what ended up happening was we saw so many different variants of that same way of crafting those requests that it became a big challenge. You really had to keep up with them. Our threat research team was constantly updating and re-releasing new signatures and things like that in order to basically prevent these bypasses from happening. Now, Rasp, on the other hand, as you mentioned, it lives within the code base itself. And so instead of looking at the request as it's coming across the wire and basically trying to infer if it's good or bad, it's really looking at how is it actually being executed by the code. And so, great example was Greg's article from earlier when we were talking about the Azure dependencies or within NPM and Node. Some of the very first things that those types of vulnerabilities go and do is they look to dump out environment variables. So they're going to run an env command or things like that. We can then see actually what's happening in the code, and we can basically model it to say that the code is not supposed to do this. So let's prevent that from actually happening in the first place. And so that's kind of the kind of structural semantic differences between how the two different technologies really work. But the flip side of that is where a WAF can be deployed further out at the edge and can be that network security tool and kind of that overarching tool. Rasp is really, because it's living in the application, you're basically having to install it directly in there. Now, developers, of course, they don't necessarily love security. They know us because we installed Fortify and came back with 100,000 vulnerabilities that they need to go and mitigate. Exactly. And the first thing they say to you is, make this disappear. Like, we don't have time to go and fix all this stuff. Just make this disappear. Yeah. And so that was actually, I think, initially where we saw a lot of traction with Rasp, was really kind of going and helping to mitigate a lot of those SaaS scans and trying to, implement a compensating control for those types of vulnerabilities. But later, I guess, as we've, seen now the insecurity of the overall supply chain related issues, that's where the conversations really started to shift. And so the way that I like to look at it now is you don't want to lose your Friday nights to emergency patching. And so Rasp is really that control that gives you the ability to basically mitigate those types of things. So
what we call virtual patching, right? That was kind of the first thing we started calling it, virtual patching. Yeah.
Exactly. So it is, it is one of those things where developers in particular, when they first start looking at it, they're like, no, I don't want this. But then you just, as a security professional, remind them of, well, do you really want to waste your Friday nights and weekends and, all these crunch cycles of doing this? Versus having this installed that we can basically use as a mechanism of ensuring that that is actually buying you time to go and do your proper testing and management of that.
Yep. No, that was kind of the first, in my mind, maybe not the first, but one of the first indications that what some people call a buzzword, and I don't believe it's a buzzword, that shift left mentality, where you're trying to get the developer more into security, but not making it onerous, not making it so difficult. And the instrumentation part, the initial time I started talking about it, that was all I got was, there's no way I'm sticking this in my code. It's just not going to happen. I'm not going to do it. Any kind of feel. And I've seen that change, not drastically, but it's been 6 years since I was at 4 to 5, something like that. So I've seen over the 6 years that I've moved back into the reseller space, this become a lot more common, and it's finally starting to make some pretty good headway into developer shops where they're very accepting of it. So, Greg, I know you've done development work. What's your take on this?
I think, well, I did dev and I did ops and now this, but from the developer side, I think a lot of it started shifting the other way, or that pendulum swings when developers started having to be in the room. So when you have a security incident of any nature, or something looks weird, whether it's the security people or the ops or the network people who notice them, they're like, hey, this is odd. We started yanking developers into the room because they're like, you own your app, you own your code, you won't let us change it. So guess what? We're going to wake you up. And that effect of shift left was kind of interesting. It became really popular while I was doing kind of the ops and observability and monitoring area. And a lot of times it was taken to developers want to be able to do everything. It's like, okay, well, let's talk about, if you want to do everything, then let's talk about how to do it right, because we'll just turn stuff off if it doesn't work. If we don't know what it is, if it's misbehaving, just going to throw it off the network and let you deal with it. Now that we're putting more tools in front of developers to be more aware, this is what your code can do. This is how your code can be abused. As organizations make their kind of security journeys, you could, but this seems like a step when you've kind of tightened all your bases and you got your nuts and bolts around the environment put together. This one is adding another layer of security. Just like a WAF with a firewall, the firewall is going to catch most of it. A WAF's going to catch the more interesting stuff. Now you back that up further and further to the point where, as an attacker, when I see this stuff, I'm like, oh no, it's going to be a bad day.
So I liken this to your point, and not with getting too deep in my personal life here, but I recently had my son's vehicle's catalytic converter stolen, and Greg knows about this because I've talked about it internally. And that was pure hell. I'm sorry, to get that thing fixed, especially in other supply chain issues. But now we've got, and in my truck too, we've installed catalytic converter shields. And the hope is we're making it difficult. The thief comes up and sees that. He's like, I'm going to the next vehicle. I'm not going to mess with this. And it's the same concept. Also, the segue there, though, is, and there's something else I want to talk to you, Peter, is that it doesn't solve everything. There are still ways around that catalytic converter shield, just like there are ways around a WAF and a Rasp. So when you're talking to customers about this, what do you specifically tell them that Rasp cannot do?
Yeah, the big thing that we find, so for Rasp, it's amazing at the more supply chain related issues. So these remote code execution vulnerabilities, anything that is basically going and trying to execute against the code that shouldn't happen, kind of classic SQL injection types of things. It's phenomenal at that. And the reason why it's phenomenal at that is because it's evaluating it at the point of it actually trying to execute it, not trying to interpret what it's actually doing. And there's lots of other things that we do basically in there, but by being able to basically differentiate or to speculate or to say definitively this is how the application should behave and don't allow it to do anything outside of that is really, really effective. Now, because it lives within the application itself, there's things that it does not do and you should not deploy it for. The number one thing that comes to mind right away is DDoS attacks. Do not try to use Rasp to stop a DDoS attack. It's going to be processing the application already, or the traffic already within the application. And so those are the types of things that we basically just ensure that, look, there's a place for the WAF, there's a place for edge protections, and being able to kind of knock down and provide that more holistic governance around all of your applications and really kind of those broad threats. But really when it gets into kind of a defense in depth conversation to be able to actually protect your applications really in that much higher level or higher degree, that's where Rasp really kind of comes into the picture for us. So it is important to know exactly what it doesn't do in those particular instances. And the other thing I'll even caution here too is there is a degree of misconfiguration that's probably its biggest weakness. And this is really, I think, where we kind of get into that earlier question that you had around kind of the practical implementations of solving it or implementing it. To be successful with it, you have to get the application teams on board. You have to be able to basically work with them to say, look, you own this as a tool. We are deputizing you guys to be in charge of your own security. We're buying you time. We're giving you kind of a baseline of what we want to see. But the actual configuration itself of what the application is supposed to do, that's what the developers are basically tasked with creating and basically monitoring. And then the security team can look at the alerts. They can make sure everything's looking good. But those are the really big things that we see are really kind of the requirements to make it really effective in production environments, is getting the application teams involved so they have that full control over how it's actually set up.
And you said deputize, and Greg's wondering why he didn't get a badge when he was in the development shop.
Oh,
That would have been fun. Sorry, I've been playing too much Red Dead Redemption here lately, so I'm all about the
Morgan.
That's awesome. I love it.
My goal with all of that was when we were trying to get into those processes was being able to help them answer questions. What's going on? What do you not know? And we had some security initiatives that were coming down that wasn't threats. They're always there, but ours was observability. We want to know what's being able to go on and chase things down. Unanswerable questions were not okay. If a security person saw something that they didn't like and you couldn't explain that this wasn't a threat, then it absolutely was a threat. And hooking things in and getting the amount of information that would help them answer those questions of, are we in trouble or are we not? Is this a all hands, everybody, abandon your weekends because here we go? Or is it, oh, well, it's interesting, but we're fine. Like we can see this thing, we see it stopped. We don't see payloads executing. All those things, as we build those layers, they stop us from having to answer those, or give us the answer to the questions, but also buy us peace of mind of I don't have to doom scroll Twitter of, what's the threat that's going to drop 4 p.m. on Friday? Is my infrastructure going to be okay? It's like, no, we're probably all right. We'll catch it.
Yeah, you said two things too that I love there. So first of all, the observability side of it, and this I think is important. So for developers that are hesitant about this type of technology, one of the things that we always tell them is it's identical to the installation process, and it actually works identically to how application performance monitoring agents work. They hook the code in the same way. They do very, very similar things. One of them is just security focused versus observability focused. Now, the great thing about this too is, like your APM agents, usually what happens is as you're going through your build process, your Jenkins pipelines or your, Bitbucket pipelines or whatever you're using, that's usually the point where you're starting to inject the actual APM code itself, and then it goes through the entire QA cycles. And that's the exact same way with Rasp as well. So the one things developers hate the most is when they release to production, and all of a sudden production's different than their non-production environment. So WAF would constantly get the blame for you're blocking traffic that you shouldn't be because it's only in production and it's only something that we see there.
Always blame the network.
Always blame it. So it's easier to have to go and solve anything else. But the great thing is you buy that, or you get that developer confidence in the solution and the technology because it goes through the QA cycles with the application. So if there is something funny that shouldn't be happening, you will have caught it before it even goes to production. Then when it goes to production and you start seeing these vulnerabilities come in, the great thing is you even get down to the line of code where it's actually executing. And so you can correlate that to your Fortify SaaS scan results or your Veracode or whatever you're using there. So you know exactly which vulnerabilities in the code were lining up to it. Or in the instance of if it's an actual 0-day vulnerability, you're one of the first people to have actually discovered that you're getting targeted by that, which is where we see pretty much financial institutions using this technology.
Yep. Well, gentlemen, I say this all the time. We could talk about this for days, and I could give Lauren a really long podcast to edit. At this point, we're already at 41 minutes, so she's already going to give me the stink eye when I get back there to the other end of the room. But no, I appreciate this. This is a great discussion. It's definitely something that Imperva is good at in the Rasp world. So web apps in general, data security. Again, great partner, Peter. Really appreciate your perspective on this, your expertise on this. It's been a great discussion. Hope to talk to you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Greg, any parting wise words?
Nope. Thanks for having me back.
Always a pleasure, sir. Always a pleasure. All right, everybody. Thank you again for joining us on the live stream podcast, episode 41. And we will see you, I think, next week. We've got kind of an accelerated schedule, so we're doing some stuff next week on asset management. Not a very sexy topic, but it has to happen. So we'll see you on episode 42. Thanks, everybody.